at that time maybe it was necessary, but we're at a point now where I think the mysteries have to be uh, publicly revealed and the secrets have to be open.
Yeah,
Totally.
absolutely.
Because we're at a crucial point where I think in Jungian terms everyone needs to become individuated, and
Hmm.
I think what the mysteries really allowed was one to basically pass through that boundary between life and death, and in doing so and returning fully healing that wound that every soul which hasn't recognized that it will survive the death of the body still retains. So in a sense, being initiated, as I mean, I can't say what it was originally for the ancients, but to me it seems to be passing uh, to the realm beyond the body as if you died, and then returning, and in that way gaining an experiential confirmation that uh, some essence is immortal, that's alive and
Absolutely.
embodied right now.
Hmm.
And it's also knowing what you are and who you are as a spark of divine light. Uh, the time falling bodies take to light.
Hmm.
Perfect title for that. You
Right,
know?
Yeah.
and it's not something that one understands intellectually, and like Plato's philosophy was separate from what he was initiated into. He couldn't say much about it. It's more of a sort of just a change in your perception of what the embodied sensory experience that you have is really all about.
Yeah,
You no longer
absolutely.
see it as um, merely a bunch of objects that exist out there independent of you, independent of your consciousness or that essence which survives death. You realize that really there's some larger thing going on, and that this temporary life that you lead now, while yeah, all the action is taking place, sure, but it's also only one small piece of this much larger process of incarnation over multiple, uh, you know, aeons and generations that stretch back into history as far as we can imagine, and as far as we can imagine too. Or at least this is the kind of cosmology that someone like Steiner allows us to imagine, and I think experience it seems to be more adequate than you know than a more materialistic cosmology where there really is there's no there's nothing going on, just a bunch of objects floating around,
Yeah.
banging into each other.
Convinced.
Uh,
Yeah, and
Convinced by the
and I think it's
illusion.
unfortunate that I right that sort of cosmology is what has uh, sort of taken root in the collective imagination, because the only sort of activity that we can then engage in meaningfully on Earth is industrial capitalism, where we try, every individual is trying to get as much pleasure out of this particular life as they can. Screw the next generation, because who cares, right?
Yeah.
mm,
That's the result of a sort of materialistic cosmology. So it's about adopting a cosmology like Steiner's, let's say, isn't just about making ourselves feel good. It actually ends up changing the way that we live our earthly lives, the kinds of things that we value while
Right.
we're alive. So
Do you think
it's
this this whole devaluation of anything imaginative or spiritual in our culture, this sort of, I guess it's really a great, for to use like Daniel Quinn's description, but he used it differently, but a great forgetting, you know? Do you think this is part of the process of remembering, to almost like,
mm.
as Thompson says, the collective dark night of the soul is that point where you completely lose connection to that divine reality, and you just totally not forget, but
yeah,
you just lose it.
perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it ties directly back into Platonic metaphysics, right? Again, his true form of knowledge was remembrance in a sense. It was remembering our divine origin as a spirit or a soul or whatever you want to call it, spark of light. And
Right.
he considered all knowledge to lead right back to that remembrance of perfect state.
Mm. I
Right.
I know
Yeah. All
one
of
of
our
the
knowledge is the soul's memory of eternity.
Mm.
This totally reminded me of the whole we mentioned in the email, the relationship between religion and spirituality, how they kind of overlap a little bit, because we're talking about these deep spiritual truths, these spiritual teachings, and I guess in the ancient times that wasn't up front to say, oh, you're all sparks, divine sparks of God, because then anybody could go off and say, oh, I'm a divine spark of God, here's my church. So there was a lot of control and trying to keep the church together. So what do you think the role of religion is? Is there going to be a place for it in the future? Will there be a new resurgence of religion for the spirit of the times, or?
I think the value is understanding the traditional or perennial value of comparative religion and what it means to understand the comparative religions, esoteric mythologies, concepts, symbols, and how they relate to the universal spiritual tradition, to use those and to master those and to have them as tools to speak about the mysteries, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think of what Carl Jung talked about in his book Answer to Job. The reason that religion is important is that, to take the Catholic Church, for example, Christ or the Christ event and that whole historical period, when just on a psychological level, people were obviously having this intense inner transform experience that was changing society. The Roman emperor had to start worrying about this new religion that just appeared out of nowhere. And that, initially, when a religion is still at that sort of prophetic, it's very chaotic. And the church basically served keeping this intense psychological transformation in check, and it sort of nursed it along, and in some ways strangled it also, and sort of death out of it. But there were still plenty of mystics within the church that were able to keep the fire alive through the centuries. But
Eckhart comes to mind.
Yeah, but just Jung, taking this very mature look at religion and recognizing its faults, but also saying that it plays an important psychological function, or it has in history. Whether or not it needs to continue into the future is an open question. I do think the question of tradition is important. We all have roots and we all live in community, and somehow we've got to come to some sense of what's going on.
Yeah, some kind of grounding.
Right. And it's just a matter of being flexible enough not to let those shared senses of what's going to become dogmas and doctrines that we hold to, regardless of what we actually encounter and experience.
I think the seekers out there who are just content with just philosophy or just learning how to, the culture to tradition, for instance, in the traditionalist school, is not to regress into the past, but it's to find a living source of spirituality in which one can be initiated into and experience the mysteries directly. The opening of the third eye, collecting of consciousness in that third eye, and the voluntary projection of that to have access to those other planes of being. So that's where tradition and initiation come into play. I don't think that we can just be content with learning about it. With the comparative aspects, like I said, they can provide a tool. We can provide a symbolic language and a mythical language to speak about the truths that are there that would otherwise be difficult to codify in rational conceptual form. But we have to go further, I think, and shouldn't be content with just learning, just formal learning, and speaking of it even.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's, I guess the role of religion has always been this sort of a grounding conduit for initiation, almost like a community and an invitation to the more transformative realms of, the esoteric dimensions.